I love visiting my local state parks, as I'm sure all of you do. One of my dream jobs has always been being a park ranger or just being a volunteer at one of these state parks. I love hearing stories from them, especially ones that give you a good scare. These subscribers share their creepiest experiences while visiting state parks and or working in state parks. So if you're a fan of park rangers and all that they see, this one's for you. If you have a creepy story that you'd like to share, send it in to the email or the website that you can find in the description down below. Let's get into these tales of terror. I worked for a state forest service in the tri-state area several years ago in a field location that was 250-year-old farmhouse. The basement was dug in compacted earth. There were large fireplaces in several rooms. A few even had pot hooks in them for heating water and cooking. There was one bathroom that had been installed in the 1940s. Prior to that, there had been none. The floorboards were wide slats of pine, and you could see the hand-forged nails. In some of the areas, they were far enough apart that you could shine a flashlight down through the cracks to see the basement floor. Mice and camel crickets were common. They were just a fact of life that we lived with, as was the ancient oil furnace we had in the basement that broke, frequently. In the winter, another odd fact was that the dug earth basement, in the farthest and darkest corner, there was a dark room for developing film. I have never even ventured into that room, because it bothered me. I'm going to recall as many of the events as I can in that loose timeline, because it's been 8 years since I worked there, so my timeline might not be exact. I always felt watched there. It was a constant feeling that remained until I got into my car to leave at night. There were often strange smells, sometimes like rosewater and oranges that had warm associations, but sometimes like rotten garbage, even when no trash was present. There was a kitchen that had been slightly modernized on at least 2 occasions. All of the cabinet doors would be shut in the morning, and then as I was upstairs working in the office, I would hear them all open, come back downstairs, and find them all wide open, seemingly by themselves. The moment you walked in the door in the morning, it was as if you felt eyes turning onto you. Our one secretary dealt with this by very loudly announcing, "Good morning," to the existing inhabitants. And she said she didn't necessarily feel threatened, but if she started hearing too many noises upstairs while she was alone, she would loudly say, "Y'all know I don't want to be hearing this. I don't mess with you, so come on, don't mess with me." And she said on some occasions it would stop, but not always. The first time I remember seeing something physically, I usually hear and see images mentally, not with my physical eye. It was about, I don't remember exactly the day, but we had a meeting going on downstairs, and I ventured upstairs to fetch a chapstick out of my bag. My back was to the main hallway, and all of a sudden I heard footsteps to the side of me. I turned and saw 2 shadowy people. One shorter than the other flashed down the hallway into the back office, making footsteps the whole way. On another occasion concerning footsteps, our secretary and I were in the office on a winter morning, just the 2 of us, and the heat was broken yet again. We sat in the same room downstairs trying to stay warm with a space heater. We couldn't use the fireplaces, they were shut down. We were laughing and talking, and all of a sudden we heard a very loud boot-clomping steps run from the downstairs foyer to the upstairs, and across the hallway, upstairs, directly over our heads to the opposite side of the house. We looked at each other and paused, but at that point, we had been used to these kind of shenanigans, and felt if we let it bother us, it wasn't going to be the best scenario, so we tried to be strong. We lost 2 cleaning people though. In the evening, after the few of us had gone home, we never had more than 6 people in the office. We had a cleaning service that came in to vacuum and try to help us with the pest issue by assuring the trash was taken out and etc. Each night, the cleaning man was to fill out a journal of what was left on my boss's cabinet to tell us what he did. After he had been there a while, he told us in the journal that he had heard his name being called while he was using the vacuum. This happened multiple times. He would turn the vacuum off and it was silent. Finally, I guess he was brave, he said he knocked on the wall and nothing happened at first. Then he knocked, and there was a response with 2 knocks back, and he quit after that. My boss had a bad habit of working later in the house after dusk, and I would sometimes work with her. But we would never stay past 6:30 or so. It just wasn't a good idea. It was though that the house had a time, and we didn't want to intrude on that. Like a mutual respect. I know that sounds strange. Before she started putting a cap on for evening hours, one night, she was working alone at her desk, facing out into the hallway, when she saw a very tall shadow person pass by the door frame. Slowly, not running like the ones I saw. She said it had to be 7 feet tall. It scared her so badly. On another occasion, she was working late, and a giant blue orb about the size of a soccer ball with electrical-looking energy coming off of it, went down the same hallway, past her door, and crashed into a metal file cabinet we had at the end of the hallway. On yet another occasion, this one was in the afternoon, she was working on a project in our large meeting room, which had likely been a dining room at some point. She was engrossed in what she was doing, and oblivious to her surroundings, when she looked up and locked eyes with a dark-haired man who looked to be in his mid-40s in 19th century dress with gray eyes. She said he looked as surprised that he saw him as she was to see him, and she saw daylight pass through him. He turned to go toward the main stairwell and disappeared. She yelled out, understandably startled, and the secretary and I came running in to see what was wrong. None of us saw him again, though we did give him a name based on what we knew of the house's history. In retrospect, I'm not sure if the name was correct, but we tried to be respectful. In that same room, I was simply passing through one afternoon, when I mentally heard a woman's voice say, with great agitation,
"This is my house!"
A tired old trope, I know, but there is validity to it when considered in the context that when a canal was being dug in the 1830s near the property, the state was purchasing tracts of land from residents in order to make room for the canal. Later in the 1960s, the state began purchasing large tracts of land in order to preserve them as state parks, one lot being where this house is located. I began leaving a recorder running overnight in different areas of the house, and there were 2 rooms where I recorded the most. One was in the oldest section of the house, that was once a family room, and the other were the servants' bedrooms upstairs, one which was my office. I should note that this house is located in a very rural area. There is a canal nearby that is now used for only recreational kayaking and fishing, and a series of hiking and horse trails, but no city sounds or noise interference from neighbors. When I left the recorder in the downstairs family room, on multiple occasions, I would play the recorder back next day and capture beautiful piano music. It sounded faint, but clearly audible. Classical music. We also experienced a scent of fresh pine in this room for no apparent reason, over and over again. The other, far less happy sounds were that of a gruff man's voice, and the sound of at least 2 children crying. I could never make out what the man was saying, and he would be taking a guess as to say what the children were saying. But it always sounded like, "I want my mommy." This is the most troubling memory I have of the house. No one likes to think that children suffered. I began going to the local hall of records for the township and doing some research. I was looking up information on the deeds and wills associated with the various individuals who had owned the house through the generations. Most were handwritten and spoke of chain as length of measure and stone markers or rocks marking where the land boundaries were. I found out the names through the most recent family who lived in the house up until 1967, who by then was renting it from the state. One particular family had been on the property for nearly 100 years and had a chance of finding a living relative. And I did, and contacted her via email to ask if she would like to visit the house, and she did. She was in her late 80s, 88 I believe at the time, but as a cousin of the family who was still living in the house in the 1930s, she visited frequently as a child. Her mind was clear, and I asked her if the family room is where they would set up the Christmas tree. She said yes. She knew that I had been doing some research on the house, and I asked her if her uncle, who lived with the family but was unmarried and died in 1950 or so, played the piano, and she said yes, that he played beautifully. She was a child and young teen there in the 1930s. I didn't want to trouble or scare her with the details of what had been going on in the house. I just treated it like it was a nostalgic event for her. This obviously doesn't explain everything, because there were so many events that happened in that house, including apparitions in clothing from different time periods, but it explained and verified at least two small pieces of the puzzle. We continued to have experiences there, as well as our contractors, such as two young men we hired. They were to repair a flashing on the roof, and they continuously blamed each other for tools disappearing and reappearing in strange unrelated places. We had to do our own cleaning because we couldn't retain a cleaning person. On yet another occasion, we had a visitor use the bathroom, where there was a slatted door closet facing the toilet. As she did her business, the closet began to shake violently and the doorknob rattled violently, as though someone were trying to escape from inside the closet. She was horribly scared, and she jumped off the toilet and pulled her pants up without even using the toilet paper. It was often mischievous, odd behavior. A few years later, we lost funding, and I had to move to a different site. But I still see the house when I'm doing extensive bike rides in the area on the Canal Town Path. The house has a field location also lost its funding, so it's been vacant for some years now. There is an old cemetery located in the Windsor State Forest in Massachusetts called Winnebago. Back in the 40s, it started as a summer camp for kids to hike, play, socialize, and do stuff while their parents were working for the summer break. It could have been up to 24 kids there per summer. The legend goes that there was an old lady as a counselor there who one day snapped and went crazy. She hung 3 girls in the barn and drowned the other 3 in a hot tub. She then killed herself. Let me tell you a quick picture. As you pull into this camp, a small house built in the late 1700s is on the left. After the house is a small shed. A medium-sized barn is located across the driveway from the house, and right next to the barn is a small cemetery with small unmarked gravestones. It is said that the 3 girls that haunt the house and 3 haunt the barn, while the old lady haunts the basement of the house. Inside the house, people have reported hearing laughter and getting small tugs on their clothing, and even seeing shadows popping out around corners. The basement is a different story. In the basement, the old woman's spirit tells you to leave, tries to scare you by moving things around, and people have even reported getting scratched by her. The girls' spirits in the barn, however, are a different story. In the barn, you can hear crying noises and even faint screams. Some have reported hearing them even outside the house. The cemetery is outside. It's like a jackpot of spirit orbs if you're filming or taking pictures. And though it's silent out there, many have reported seeing apparitions and shadows in the cemetery. I myself have been to the cemetery before, a few times. Mind you, each time I was there I was completely sober. The first time I went with a few friends, we all had flashlights. We stepped out of the car, and before we could even turn them on, I stopped everyone and told them to stand still. It was dead silent. Nothing. No bugs, no birds, no noise from houses around. It was eerily quiet. Unsettlingly quiet. That made me nervous. We walked towards the house and shined a flashlight in the window. We saw a head move out of the window as soon as we did it. The girls with us freaked, but we convinced them to keep moving. We explored the main floor of the house, but we didn't hear anything really. So we went over to the barn. One of the girls, all of a sudden, was overcome with sadness and dropped right to her knees, crying uncontrollably. That freaked the rest of us out, so we picked her up and put her in the car and left fast. Keep in mind, we didn't really hear much of anything. We may have seen an apparition in the window, but that was about it. But the presence up there, I can't explain it. It just feels wrong, like you're being watched and followed. I'm man enough to admit I'm too scared to return there. This story starts with a group of my friends and myself going backpacking in Yellow River State Park. 6 of us were backpacking through the hills during late fall. So, there was a lot of dead sticks and leaves all around, yet not very many other backpackers until we came across of a couple of guys heading the opposite way. As we came close to them, they stopped and told us that we shouldn't go down into the valley, as they were there for the last 2 nights. We asked why not, and they said that they heard people talking near their tent in the middle of the night, even though they were the only ones there. My friends and I shrugged it off, because we ourselves have drunkenly wandered around at night exploring and stargazing. We continued down into the valley and set up our tents. There was 2 of us in each tent. 3 of us brought firearms, just because we were kinda paranoid. We would rather have them and not need them instead of not having them and needing them due to previous experiences. We could all set up and break out our liquor and cards and play a few games in front of the fire before we decide to call it a night. One of our friends passed out in front of the fire and didn't wake up when we tried to move him, so we decided we would just let him make his own way to the tent when he was ready, and ended up going to bed without him. All of a sudden, we are woken up in the middle of the night of a semi-drunk slumber to our friend screaming at the top of his lungs, high-pitched and everything. We jumped out of our tents to find out why our friend was yelling. Who the hell was that? We had no clue what he was talking about until we saw his face. Now, you know when your friend is the first person to pass out at a party, you doodle all over his face with Sharpie? Well, apparently, some stranger was doing the same thing with charred wood and ashes. The problem was that he had an upside-down cross on his forehead and a pentagram on his shirt. I'm not religious at all, but I was kind of freaked out. We ended up going back into the tents, but I don't think any of us got much sleep. Then, at about 3:30 a.m., we started to hear rustling in the woods around us. It seemed to be everywhere though. Then, we heard a voice say,
"Give him to us."
Now I was freaked out and loaded a round into my pistol, but my friend seemed to jump the gun. Yes, same trigger happy friend, and fired a round from his .22 into the air, through his tent. I then hear people running away from what seemed to be all around us. Needless to say, at first light, we packed up and got the hell out of there. We contacted the county sheriff's office and told them what happened, but they simply told us that there really wasn't much we could do besides report it. My fiancé and I postponed our wedding in 1990. We were getting stressed and needed a vacation. We lived on the Big Island in Hawaii, so naturally we went to the mainland. We did not have much money, so we rented a car, bought a tent, and decided to try to visit and camp in as many state/national parks in the western US as we could. We were driving in the middle of nowhere on our way to Yellowstone. It was a desert-like area we were driving through, and it was the end of September. It was very hot. We saw an old building far from the road and decided to take a break to explore it. As we approached the building, we could hear flies and the smell of something bad. We opened the door and it was like a big farm building. The walls and metal roof were splattered in blood. Everywhere we looked were body parts of elk. I am from the islands, but my fiance was from Northern California and familiar with wildlife. He said they were elk bodies. There must have been at least 50 or more of them in there. It was so strange. They looked like they were torn apart. Pieces of meat were flung and hung all over inside the building. I freaked out and started to cry. The smell and sights were overwhelming. My fiance said he couldn't understand it, because it was not like they were being processed or collected for anything. All the meat or horns or everything else was just in there, strewn apart. And he said it looked like they were torn apart, not cut with a knife. I had to go. I felt like I was in shock. My fiance refused to let me call the police. He said he did not want to get involved. He said it must be the work of crazy poachers. A few miles later, we entered Yellowstone National Park, where as usual, we chose an out-of-the-way campsite. We were on high alert as we had been listening to a news story on the radio about a female hiker camping in a remote area of the park alone. Apparently, she was torn apart by a grizzly bear. There were few details about the attack, and I'm sure I'm unable to find any written reports of it anywhere online. Because we heard the news report on the radio for several days before getting to the park, I find it odd that I can't find much on it. We had a campsite with a bathroom nearby and a barbecue. There were very few people in the park and no one camping near us. There were signs everywhere warning people that they should be careful with food storage because of the bears. We had a couple beers and went to sleep in the tent. I often got hungry after dinner and decided to take a bag of pears into the tent, thinking that if I put it under my pillow, that no animals could smell it there. Remember, I'm from Hawaii, and we do not have wild animals here. There are no bears, skunks, possum, squirrel, chipmunk, armadillo, wolverines, elk, lions, or snakes. We do have deer and boar in the mountains, but they were introduced by European hunters like 100 years ago or so. I fell asleep, pears snugly under my pillow. I was awakened by an immense weight on my upper right side of my chest. My entire right arm and right side of my torso felt like it was stuck. My first thought was bear. There's a bear on top of me wanting my pears. But as the seconds developed into minutes, and the minutes turned into hours, this immersive weight never once moved, nor did it shift, or twitch, or even make a single sound. In the first second, I decided not to move or make any noise, and definitely not awaken my boyfriend, who was soundly sleeping to my left. I felt myself beginning to panic, thinking that it had to be a bear attracted to my pears or something. But as time dragged on, I realized if this were a wild animal, it was literally on top of me, inches from the fruit. It would have pawed or done something to get inside the tent, or at least shifted, moved, or snorted, or breathed as living things do. But to me, I felt like a car was parked on the upper right half of my body, the way it was so heavy and unmoving. What the weirdest aspects besides it being a massive, unmoving, totally silent something was that it was warm. This flurry of thoughts and confusion literally dragged on for hours. I became so terrified and overwhelmed. I knew whatever was sitting or standing or laying or parked on me could not have been of this world. Once, after all the hours of trying not to breathe heavily, panic, or even twitch a muscle, I passed out cold from sheer terror. My mind and body just shut down. I totally understand now, when people see a cryptid or a monster, why they faint or lose bowel control. The big difference with me was I could not see it, I could only feel it. And thinking it was a grizzly bear, that could cause its razor-sharp teeth and claws to easily get into the tent, which made it so more confusing. When I woke up the next day, my fiancé was already up. I told him what happened, and I was completely freaked out. I checked the tent for any marks or signs of something on the fabric, but there was nothing. There was also no suspicious paw prints or footprints around the tent campsite. Instead of listening to my story, my fiancé stopped me at the part about the pears under the pillow and scolded me for quite a while. I was totally still freaked out and wanted to leave. My right arm and the right side of my body were aching. That was not a dream, nor was it sleep paralysis. I have never been that terrified in all of my life. Never before or since that have happened. I told this story to an experienced Sasquatch researcher, and he said these types of tent antics are pretty common with juvenile Sasquatch. He said many researchers and witnesses believe that Sasquatch can actually see through the tent fabric somehow and enjoy harassing campers. He calls campers within tents sack lunches. He described how campers tell of being in their zipped up tent and then being picked up and carried several feet away. Other witnesses describe hearing their tent zipper unzip and a hairy hand reach in to touch them. I think what convinced me that this was a Sasquatch reclining on my tent was that what the research explained about Sasquatch abilities, that are able to remain unmoving, even without a twitch or spasm for literally hours at a time. He pointed out how in nature they use this ability to camouflage themselves so effectively. Last Thursday night, me and my fiance were driving around looking for something to do, around 11 p.m. Our friend Sierra called us and asked if we wanted to meet her and her new boyfriend at a diner in town. We got there and had some pies and decided we should do something. None of us had to work Friday, so we were going to hit the bars. Me and my fiance went to grab another friend of ours who wanted to come. After we got him, we all met back up at the 7-Eleven. It turned out that all the bars were empty, so we were brainstorming what to do instead. That's when Sierra suggested we go to the cemetery. We live in a city at the end of the Oregon Trail, and what used to be the outskirts of the city was a little state park. The park is located on top of a large cliff. Also, about a mile from the parking lot is a cemetery you can only go to by walking. The cemetery used to be an Indian graveyard, but over time they would put people who lived in the city in the graveyard too. Also, settlers used to chase off Indians off this cliff in droves, and many of the people of Indian descent have committed suicide by jumping off this cliff. Honestly, the whole place is just creepy and has this vibe, even during the day. Anyway, my fiance was really against it, but the group talked him into just going to the park. We get there around 1 a.m., and we are standing at the top of the cliff which overlooks the city. Everything is okay for a while, but then my fiance quiets everyone down, and I swear to God we both heard footsteps to our left. Our whole group was to our right. We freaked out and made the whole group leave. As we were leaving, I looked at my fiance and something to our left caught my eye. It was a bright ball. It came up from the top of the trees, made an arc and came back down. It wasn't like transparent like a flashlight. It was a solid, like if the moon were really off in the distance, but still really bright and white. I even thought it was the moon for a second, but then I looked up and saw the moon big and full, and red from smoke from fires all over the state. Later in the car, I asked my fiance and our friend that we picked up earlier if they had seen it too. They had, so I wasn't going crazy for a second. There was actually something there. As we got to the car, my fiance looked behind us and swears he saw another white orb in the forest. But it couldn't have been a lamp or something because we were at the edge of the city and there weren't houses for miles. Also, there were no other cars in the parking lot, so it couldn't have been another person. Anyway, we drove out there as fast as we could. We dropped off our friend, and he had me drive his car because he was too freaked out. By the time I drove myself home, he seemed fine. Looking back, I really wish I had spent the night with him. The night after he dropped me off, everything was fine for a while, but once he started driving around the back roads near his house, weird things began to happen again. He listens to music on Pandora while driving. Well, mid-song the track somehow skipped from Tiny Dancer to Dance with the Devil. Then, something black ran in front of him. He slammed on the brakes so not to hit it. He looked behind in the mirror to make sure there wasn't someone driving behind. That's when he saw a pair of eyes and dark outline of a person in his back seat. Then the song changed back to Tiny Dancer and the figure was gone. He parked the car in his driveway and ran inside on full panic. Nothing else happened that night, but he was a bag of nerves for days. The following story involves a group of my friends and I backpacking in Yellow River State Park. 6 of us were backpacking in the late fall, when not many people were around, when we came across a couple of guys heading in the opposite direction. They informed us we shouldn't go into the valley, as they had spent the last couple of nights there and could hear people talking outside their tent at night, despite no one else being around. My friends and I laughed it off as we'd drunkenly been stargazing in the past, and didn't think much of the story. We eventually reached the valley and set up our tents. There were 2 of us per tent, and 3 of us had firearms on us. After setting up, we broke out the liquor and cards to play some games before calling it a night. By the end of the card games, one of our friends had passed out near the fire, and we decided that we'd leave him there putting the fire out, as they weren't getting up. Later that night, we were awoken to the sound of our friend screaming. "Who the hell was that?" Having no clue what he was on about, we all looked at him and realized someone had drawn on his face with ash from the fire. They'd drawn an upside-down cross on his forehead and a pentagram on his shirt. I'm not religious by any means, but I was pretty freaked out by this, that some random person came out of the woods and did that. I think that would freak out anybody, really. After returning to our tents, unable to sleep, we heard rustling in the woods around us. I believe it was about 3:30 in the morning when this happened. It was at this point we heard someone yelling,
"Give him to us! Give him to us! Give him to us!"
I freaked out and loaded a pistol, but my friend fired a round from his .22 into the air immediately. The sounds of people running away surrounded us all from all sides. The moment we had light, we left and also reported what happened to sheriffs, but they said they could do nothing but take a report. A lot of help they were. Be careful out in Yellow River State Park. When I was 24, I went to Newton Battlefield State Park in Elmira, New York with an ex-girlfriend of mine and one of her friends. We spent the day exploring and visiting all the signs that had information about how it had been a battle site in old wars and had been visited by George Washington as well as other notable historical figures. I found it all quite fascinating, even though I wasn't much of a history buff myself. Anyway, the sun had set about an hour or 2 prior, and we settled into our cabin. Now, I will say we had beer and weed on us, but up to this point, we had only 1 beer each and were rolling up our first blunt. I say this so you know the intoxication wasn't a factor, as we were pretty straight at that point. It was dark along the pathway that we were walking, and we all had our backs to the cabin. I heard footsteps coming up the walkway, and quickly stashed the illegal leafy substance under my camping chair. As I put it away, and my ex and her friend both heard the steps as well, and looked in the direction of the walking noise, in the distance, light of the campfire, we saw a set of eyes. The noise soon walked past the right side of the cabin before continuing on past and eventually to the left side of the cabin, where it stopped on the side of the cabin we were sitting on. I felt we were busted as I hid the weed under the chair before I asked, "Is there anything I can help you with?" There was no reply, and all I could make out was the eyes glowing with the light of the fire. We grabbed the flashlight I had in my lap and turned it on. I went to point it at the eyes, but before I could beam it into the eyes, it turned away, as though it was going to continue on its path. When I finally arrived where this thing would be, there was nothing but the sound of walking continuing down the path. We spent the rest of our night in the cabin, too freaked out at what we saw and heard. I've only ever experienced 4 to 5 paranormal events in my life, and this is one that I question the most. After all, I wasn't alone in my experience this time. I am 29 years old and have been researching and investigating the paranormal since I had my first experience at the age of 9 in 1998. I'm an extremely realistic and logical person who is not easily excited over things that go bump in the night. I have seen and experienced some things in my life that most people have not. Some don't believe and some do believe, but that's okay, because I'm not here to convince anyone of anything. I'm just here to share. My lights in the sky experience happened a few years ago in 2014. I was living in New York and went to Jones Beach State Park one fall night with a friend of mine. It was a chilly night, so we didn't plan on staying out too long, but it was nice to be able to walk along the boardwalk without dealing with the crowds of people. We soon stopped at the covered picnic area and to sit down and chat. The night was clear enough to see the stars, which can sometimes be difficult with all the light pollution on Long Island. We lost track of time with our conversations, and as we got up to leave, I had to glance up at the sky. I love the stars, and I noticed something odd. A very bright light had appeared over the horizon that wasn't there a moment ago. My friend, seeing that I was staring off into space, looked up and thankfully saw it as well. Two initial thoughts crossed our minds. One, it was an airplane, or two, it was just another star. We watched it for a few solid minutes, but it never moved from where it sat, ruling out the possibility of it being an airplane. Side note, my boyfriend is an airplane pilot and I spend a lot of time watching airplanes. This definitely was not one. So a few moments go by when we notice a second light, just as bright as the first, appear seemingly out of nowhere. It manifested right below the first light and just hovered there. Naturally, we looked at one another perplexed. When we looked back up again, a third light was now appearing below the first two. I don't know how long we stood there looking at these lights, but we did verbally discuss all the possibilities that might explain what they were. We tried very hard to be realistic in debunking this phenomenon. After a while, the lights shifted, taking a triangular pattern. Again, we stood mesmerized. They did not change positions again. After what felt like forever, we finally decided that we should leave as it was starting to get late. We started to walk away, assuming that when we looked back these lights would be gone. Interestingly enough though, they weren't. They stayed right up there in the sky in that triangular pattern for almost our entire walk back out to the car. Only when we reached the park exit did they disappear. We believe what we saw were UFOs, though I'm not 100% comfortable labeling it as alien per se. UFO does stand for Unidentified Flying Object, which is exactly what they were. It was just one of my many inexplicable experiences I've had thus far in life. I wish we had a definitive answer as to what we saw out there that night. My boyfriend and I headed to a state park near us. It's far enough out so there is no noise or light pollution, but it gets dead silent out there quite often. You have to drive a few miles out of town to get there, and it's nothing short of a desert and farmland. Once you pull in, you can choose whether to go to the left to the nearest park side or turn right and drive out to some more paths to the bison to the farthest side. This was before the park turned public, so at the time, there was no curfew. It's a really cool park. It actually has trees and ponds. It's a quick getaway from life pretty much and is so quiet and the privacy is nice. We decided to go to the nearest side of the park and we talked and walked around until it got dark. Once it was dark, we laid in the back of his truck, looking at the stars and made out. It was a beautiful summer night. It was 1 or 2 in the morning when we finally decided to leave. We made our way out of the park slowly. We were about to turn and exit when we saw a car entering. There's only one way to enter and exit the park, so we sat and waited. The car looked like one most older people might drive. I didn't think anything of it until I noticed it was driving very slowly. I began to feel uneasy as we waited for this car to pass, and it felt like it took forever. Since the bright lights were on, we could see the car and driver very well. To our surprise, it was an old lady. She had short white curly hair and very pale skin. She must have been in her 80s. The woman kept both of her hands on the steering wheel. What the hell was an old lady doing this far out of town at 2 in the morning by herself? She was facing forward and stopped her car in front of us before slowly turning her head to face us. This was the point where we froze. The woman's eyes were completely black. Then, just as slowly as before she turned her head forward, she slowly turned right and drove off into the darkness to the furthest part of the park. I don't remember her headlights being on. We both got spooked and quickly left the park. I was confused by the whole situation. I have so many questions, but I'd rather not ask them. We lived in New Mexico, and we always hear stories of aliens and skinwalkers, but I don't know what that was. Perhaps it was a demon or even a devil. It has been 10 years since that happened, and I still think about it very often. A few months later, we drove out to the dirt roads to get away for a little bit. The sun was just setting. I knew we should have gone home as soon as it got dark, but I decided that we would park and relax. That's when we saw a humanoid figure that was dirty, had very long legs, and it ran on all fours. It ran into the field next to us, which I think was an alfalfa field, and vanished within seconds. I'm aware of many stories in New Mexico about skinwalkers, but I really never paid attention or believed in them. I figured it was a native superstition or the stuff you tell kids to make them stay in at night or give them a good scare. We mentioned what we saw a couple of times to some friends, and they too have stories about seeing weird things out by the dirt roads. We haven't been out driving like that in a while. However, it just seems dangerous. We are unsure if what we saw was a skinwalker or something else completely, but we've kept ourselves away from the state parks and the dirt roads, for the most part anyway. Some background information. I really love the summertime. I love hiking, being outdoors, and hanging with friends while camping and such. So during the summer of 2005, I was already starting to plan a little overnight camping trip in a national forest a couple of towns away from where I live. It is also important to mention that I do these types of things solo, and that this was my first time going with that specific national forest. I guess I was ultimately unprepared with this trip because while getting there, I had realized that I forgot to bring a ground cover for my tent, since I didn't use a tent with a built-in ground cover at the time. I also forgot some other small things, however. I was already more than halfway to the national forest, so I said F it and kept going anyways, since it was just going to be an overnighter. Things got worse when there was also a lot of traffic on the highway, throwing me a couple of hours off schedule. On my way there, I kept on glancing at the sky and looking at the sunset. Crap, I thought. It was already getting dark out. After 20 minutes of driving from the exit, I got to the mountains and there was nothing but trees on either side of the road. So not having been there before, I thought that I was already in the park. There was a moment I pondered how strange it was that there were no signs at the entrance, but already behind schedule and needing to set up camp, the thought disappeared as quickly as it came from my mind. After around 20 more minutes of driving through pure forest, and the road turned to gravel, I thought to myself, this has to be some sort of camping area, right? Looking back, I should have turned around there, but I was exhausted and a little stubborn by that point, so I was still dead set on finding some spot to camp. I finally settled on parking near a clearing on a dirt path and set up camp there. When I got out of my truck, things seemed fairly normal. The only thing that seemed out of place at the time, that there was no other sounds except for the crickets and the sound of me setting up camp. No wind, no frogs, owls, not even the howl of a wolf, just the crickets and myself. It was already getting late by that point. It was a little past 9, so I had dinner, sat around the campfire for a little bit, and then crashed in my tent. I awoke at 11:15. I thought I had woken up because my back was stiff and due to me sleeping on the bare ground, but my back seemed fine. I came to the conclusion that I had woken myself up randomly, and so I tried to go back to bed. Soon after closing my eyes again, I heard what sounded like a deep, raspy "roo" not far in the distance. That was presumably what had woken me up initially. I sat up immediately. Now what in the hell was that? I murmured to myself, since this didn't seem like the howl or growl of any animals I knew about. I went back to my sleeping bag, desperately thinking of myself of a logical explanation as to what made that sound. Maybe it was an owl being killed by a wolf or something, was what I concluded. After around 2 minutes of trying to fall back asleep, I was immediately jolted straight awake by that same shrieking sound right next to the wall of my tent. In pure shock, I immediately jolted up, bust out the front of my tent and ran straight in the opposite direction of what I heard. I didn't look back, and I also was unable to catch a glimpse of what it was. I was running for a couple of seconds when I slipped down a hill and tumbled for a couple of seconds until I stopped. I tried to keep as still as possible. Maybe the thing didn't see me fall, I thought. I didn't want to give away where I was. I listened closely, but there was no sound. I waited a little longer, still nothing. I peeked over the hill, trying to see as much of my campsite as I could in the pitch darkness. I didn't see any of it. While doing this, I noticed how there were no crickets chirping anymore. Pure silence. I didn't hear any leaves crunching either. To me, it seemed to be all clear that I could make a beeline for my tent, grab my pack, which had some miscellaneous stuff in my wallet in it, but most importantly my keys, and hightail it out of there. I knew I had to make this quick, so I tried to get to my car as quickly as possible while making the least amount of sound. I eventually got my keys from my bag, at which point I went over to the car, unlocked it, and turned the car on. Once I did this, I started to floor it out of there. I knew I shouldn't have done what I was going to do next, but I took one last look back at the tent. Crouching down, right beside the tent was the thing. Even in the darkness, I could make out its features. Its eyes were completely black, its body was covered with short white hair, and the overall body structure was barely that of a human. I knew it saw me because I saw it. The creature let out a screech that I'm all too familiar with now. I punched the gas pedal on my car and didn't stop until I got to a hotel a good distance away from the neck of the forest. I must have looked like a backwoods insane person or something when I came into the lobby all dirty in my pajamas. But I still got a room and immediately collapsed into the bed, exhausted. I had a nightmare that night where I was looking at myself in the third person, sleeping in my motel room, and the creature appeared at my window slowly before letting out a horrific screech. I jolted awake to the sound of nothing but my own heavy breathing and the crickets outside. I might be paranoid, but I'm fairly certain that at one point, that night, I heard the same screeching again, off in the distance. This happened to me a year ago on a camping trip with my dad in late July or early August. It was a weekend trip and we were the only ones at the campground. For privacy purposes, I will not state the name of the park we were camping at, but I will say that it was in the state of Indiana. Anyway, I was awoken with a start one night in my tent. Checking the time on my phone, it was around 3:30 a.m. I was hesitant at first to get out of the tent, but my bladder was screaming, which forced me to get out of the tent. The sounds of the forest I would have had any other time found comforting, but this time, for whatever reason, they seemed to unnerve me. About 50 yards away, and uphill, was a porta potty, and since I am a girl, I can't just pee in the woods, so I grabbed the headlamp which my mom had loaned me, turned it on, and headed to the porta potty. I was talking to myself in an attempt to calm my nerves, mostly because I was complaining about my bladder, and how dim the headlamp was. The light was so faint that it only illuminated 5 feet in front of me, so I ended up relying on the light of the moon to guide me. I made it to the porta potty without incident, relieved my bladder, and then headed back to the tent. Once I was around halfway there, it struck me. The forest was now silent. eerily silent. My mind began imagining the horrors of what was lurking in the woods. Skinwalkers, Wendigos, Bigfoot, who were just waiting for me to get in range so they could snatch me up and make me their dinner. With the speed of an Olympic runner, I sprinted the last 20 yards back to camp faster than anyone's ever seen. The headlamp died almost as I got there. Upon arriving at camp and catching my breath, I got the sensation I was being watched. I turned to face the tree line that bordered the lake and saw a pair of large yellow golden eyes. My tent is very close to this tree line, so whatever this thing was less than 15 feet away. Frozen in fear, I stared back at the eyes, then my headlamp went out. But the eyes of this creature were still glowing. I am a rational person, so I first figured it was a coyote or a large stray dog, and my headlamp's light was just reflecting off the eyes, giving the illusion that they were glowing. So when my headlamp went out, I expected the eyes to do the same. However, they did not. They were indeed glowing a golden yellow. Terrified, I took a few steps back and lost my balance, falling onto my butt. The eyes got closer, and the moonlight shone on this monstrosity of a creature, revealing a silhouette that in no way matched the size of a coyote or a dog. It was far larger and appeared to be on its hind legs. If I had to guess, the creature stood taller than 6 feet and had a hunched-over body. It had the head of a dog. If I had to guess, it looked like the head shape of a husky or a wolf dog. Now, I know most people, when they talk about encountering dogmen, they mention a strong feeling of malevolence coming from the creature. For some reason, I think I felt the opposite. The eyes of the creature did not seem to hold any sort of malice or seemingly intent to harm me. Rather, I got the sense it was curious, or at the very least confused. After engaging in a staring contest with this creature, which probably lasted just about a minute, but felt like forever, the creature got back to all fours and retreated into the forest. But it made no sound as it did so. Was it Dogman or a werewolf or whatever you want to call it? I don't know. I know it wasn't a bear. We don't have grizzlies in Indiana, and black bears aren't all that common. I'm honestly at a loss as to what this creature was. It left no tracks behind in the muddy banks of the lake. If any of you know what it could be, please comment down below letting me know. I was backpacking in Arkansas, the Eagle Rock Loop in the Washita National Forest. There's a section of the trail that goes through an area called the Albert Pike Recreation Area. In June of 2010, a flash flood killed 20 people, including men, women, and children. There's a ton of stories online about this event if you want to look it up. So I start my trip at Little Missouri Falls, going counterclockwise. It's 26 miles with some pretty good climbs. You can find a map of the loop on Google Images. So I hiked a fairly long day. If you Google Eagle Rock Loop map, you will find a basic sketch map, not the Topo map, just one of the basic ones with the labels of the trails, mountains, and water crossings on Pinterest. At the bottom of the map, there is a single water drop with a yellow circle around it. This just means it's always a wet crossing. There are several yellow circled water drops. The single one at the very bottom right next to the Viles Branch Trail. That is exactly where I was camped, so anyone can go there if you want to look it up and see what I'm talking about. So, that is the Little Missouri River. The water is flowing away from Albert Pike. I'm maybe 4 to 5 miles downstream from where the flash flood occurred. I don't know if this is significant or not to my story, but I'm not ruling it out either. I set up camp at about 4 p.m. for the day. This was November of last year. Fairly cold nights. It was about 26 degrees the night before. I was expecting another cold night in the high 20s. Not a lot of movement around there that night when it was cold. Most animals hunker down. I use a tarp where both ends are open. I have an inflatable sleeping pad and my 35-degree sleeping bag. Now, I'm set up on completely level ground. On my pad, on the tarp inside my sleeping bag, I quickly fall asleep around 10 p.m. after sitting around the fire. Everything is normal all evening, and all night for the most part. Now, you know when you're asleep and you fall in your dream? You get that sensation like you're falling in real life when you tense up and always wake up on impact. Okay, well I was asleep and I get the sensation sort of where I feel like I'm being dragged out of my tarp by my feet. Except it wasn't by my feet, I was being pulled by my sleeping bag. Like my whole pad with me in it suddenly being dragged out quickly. I woke suddenly as it startled me. Keep in mind, it was really cold, low 30s to high 20s at this point, and I have a 35-degree sleeping bag, so I'm inside my bag all the way with the top closed off by a shock cord. I'm completely inside my bag covered to stay warm. Now, I'm wide awake and listening for any movement. Everything is still and quiet, except for the river next to me, obviously. That is the only sound I can hear. I didn't peek out my head. I just laid there awake and listening. I sat there for a good 15 minutes listening for any sound outside of the river. I never heard anything. Granted, the river is pretty loud being right there, but there was no movement around my camp at all. So I chalked it up to having that falling sensation when you dream. I figured I must have been dreaming about something and it made me feel like that I fell or something. I went to sleep for 30 or 45 minutes longer, still keeping my ears open but figuring I was probably just dreaming. So for the most part, I just shrugged it off and put my mind off of it and got back to sleep. Morning comes and I get up and put my shoes on and roll out of bed. I head straight over to the fire to pit it and stoke at the fire for first thing because it's definitely cold outside at 6:30 a.m. this morning. I turn back towards my tarp and head over to get my food hanging close by. That's when I noticed it, and I froze. My pad and sleeping bag at the foot end are sticking out from under my tarp, by a good 1.5 feet at least. I can think about how now, as I felt being dragged out from under my tarp the night before, staring at how my bed is from under the tarp. I slowly approach the tarp and look for any sort of footprints. The problem is I don't even see my own because the ground is so compact around there. I double check and I'm not in any sort of slope at all. The ground is completely flat. I really have no idea how this happened, and I know I was startled awake by that sensation of swiftly sliding down the hill towards my feet. My pad with me in it was being dragged out. I quickly had breakfast, packed up and headed out. I was supposed to spend one more night on the trail, but the longer I hiked the more I thought that what would happen the next night. These thoughts running in my head the entire day as I walked. Could it have been another person? I didn't hear anything. Why would anyone do that to anyone else? How could I have slid down so far? Maybe it was an animal. It couldn't have been. There were no punctures in my mattress and there were no footprints anywhere. Did I just slide throughout the night with restless sleep? It doesn't make any sense. I normally sleep on a slight incline, and I've never slid outside of the tarp before. Was this paranormal? I'm not far from Albert Pike. Could this have been some sort of ghost trying to save me from a flash flood horror that it was reliving over and over? All day long, the same things were running through my head. I ended up hiking to my car and sleeping in there that night. The Athens Big Fort Trail was very tough going up over 6 mountains. It was almost dark after I descended the last one. I hiked the last 3 or so miles by headlamp in the dark. I wasn't keen on sleeping on the trail another night after that. Truth is, I've been on that trail a ton, and will for sure go back. I've been all over Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Mexico, and Colorado. Around 750 miles and countless nights spent in the woods all over the place. I almost exclusively hike solo. I never carry a gun or bear spray. I don't carry a SAT phone or GPS transponder. That is the only weird and unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me regarding camping, backpacking, and the outdoors. I went to a summer camp when I was younger, and every summer at the camp there was a 4-way long camping trip in the nearby national park. I decided to go on it, and our first day we canoed for almost 7 hours into what seemed to be the middle of nowhere. It was a couple hours before dark when we decided to make camp, and we pulled into a tiny bay and disembarked. One of the other kids in our group, there were about 10 of us campers and 4 counselors, immediately decided to head into the woods to collect some firewood, while the rest of us set up the site. Not 2 minutes later, he came sprinting back, shouting that he found a few people in the woods in huts and teepees. I remember laughing along with everyone else. He was sort of a goofy guy, so we thought he was full of shit, until we noticed how serious he still was, so most of us decided to investigate. We slowly made our way through the dense forest, and less than 200 feet from the campsite was a clearing with people milling about. Set up in the clearing were actual teepees, along with a few huts made of branches. At the back of the clearing was a bunch of pickup trucks, and behind them was a dirt track leading away. And not 15 feet in front of us as we emerged from the woods was a huge table with probably 40 people sitting at it. They stopped and stared at us, and we stared back. Then this small, older woman with a feather in her hair stood up. She smiled and offered us some food. Our head trip counselor politely declined, then asked if it was okay if we were camping nearby. She said it wouldn't be a problem, and already the other people were getting back at their huge meal. She sat down and we turned and headed back to the shore of the lake. We were all pretty stunned that we were going to be staying the night a few steps away from a lot of random strangers in the woods, but the counselor said it would be fine and finished setting up the camp. We all turned in pretty early though. Now that I'm even older than those counselors were, I don't think I would have had the balls to stay there through the night. The next morning we got up really early and we were getting ready to leave. Suddenly, a voice called out from the woods. The old woman from the table stepped out and asked if any of us had seen her husband. Now, none of us knew who her husband was or what he looked like, and considering we had interacted with these people for less than a minute, it was pretty weird that she would come over to ask about him. Also, I swear this is total truth, she was holding a huge knife. I remember we were all very still, and one of the counselors said we hadn't seen him. She turned and left, and we hauled ass out of there. It wasn't until we got to the next lake that the counselor in my canoe relaxed and acknowledged and fucked up that had been. As if it wasn't enough, on the last night of the trip, I woke up in the pitch black middle of the night and stepped out of the tent. All 10 of us kids shared to go pee. When I was younger, I woke up to pee a lot, but it was the first time on this particular trip. As I started peeing, I heard rustling and noises, and then a short howl. We were camped on the side of a very narrow inlet and extended far back in the main lake, and in the darkness on the side of the inlet you could see glowing eyes. I have almost never been scared, but I bravely finished peeing and slowly, yes slowly, went back into my tent. I'm not religious at all, but that was one and only time that I felt legitimately prayed for those wolves that they didn't come over the water or around us. Sorry for the length of the story.
Thanks for watching this video. Much appreciated, guys. If you enjoyed these stories, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, as it really does help me a lot. If you're new to the swamp, why not subscribe and hit those notification buttons to never miss a video. I upload videos almost every single day on all things creepy and anomalous. If you have a story that you'd like to share on a future video, if you have a story that you'd like to share on the channel, be sure to send it in to the email or the website that is in the description down below. On screen now you will see some cool things that you can click on, such as this Missing 411/Park Ranger series called I Know Why People Are Going Missing in the Woods. It's almost 2 hours long, and part 3 is coming soon, so you don't want to miss this thrilling, creepy story.